Bonjour, je suis 𝘗𝘲𝘲𝘪, coordonnatrice de l'action éducative, citoyenne et culturelle au Musée McCord. Au nom du musée, je souhaite la bienvenue à cette conférence intitulée « En coulisses avec parachute », présentée dans le cadre de la série des découvertes McCord et de l'exposition Parachute, mode subversif des années 80. The McCord Museum sits on land used and occupied by indigenous people for millennia that has never been ceded by treaty. The 𝘗𝘢𝘥𝘚 Nation has a profound and ongoing attachment to this territory, which it calls 𝘗𝘢𝘥𝘚. Acknowledging that colonialism has had devastating consequences on First Peoples, the McCord Museum recognizes its duty to raise awareness and support continued vitality of indigenous cultures. Today's conference is presented by Alexis Walker. Alexis joined the McCord Museum as a curatorial assistant in dress, fashion, and textiles in 2015. She has a BFA in textiles from the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design and a MA in fashion and textile studies from the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. She is particularly interested in the intersections of contemporary fashion with art, music, film, and pop culture. She was curatorial assistant for Fashioning Expo 67, co-curator of 𝘗𝘢𝘆𝑴𝘅𝑗𝑐𝑡 Fashion and Inspiration, a joint exhibition with the Musée de la 𝘗𝘍𝑢𝑡𝑒𝘥𝑐𝑖𝑣𝑒. She is curator of Parachute, Subversive Fashion of the '80s, and the author of the book Parachute, Subversive Design and Street Fashion. In addition to her curatorial work, Walker is an embroidery and textile artist, as well as a former fashion and costume designer and stylist. She has taught fashion history at George Brown College in Toronto and La Salle College in Montreal. She is also the social media coordinator for the Costume Society of America, Northeastern region. The activity will last 45 minutes in English, followed by a 15-minute question and answer that can be addressed in French and English via the Zoom platform or on the museum's Facebook page. Merci Alexis d'être avec nous ce midi.
Hi everyone, welcome and thanks for joining me today for this behind-the-scenes look at the McCord's exhibition Parachute, Subversive Fashion of the '80s. My name is Alexis Walker, as Elisa said. I'm the Associate Curator of Dress, Fashion, and Textiles here at the McCord Museum. For my talk today, I'd like to walk you through the exhibition and explain in more detail my curatorial process, some of the object and design choices, and issues we came up against during its development. Parachute was founded in Montreal in 1977 by British fashion designer Nicola Pelly and American architect and urban planner 𝘗𝘢𝘅𝘓𝘓. Nicola Pelly, who still lives in Montreal, graciously donated her extensive parachute archive and collection of clothing to the museum in 2019. And it was primarily this collection that I drew from for research and content for this exhibition. Not only did Nicola give her archive, she was more or less co-curator on this project with me, and we worked very closely for 2 years on every step of its development. Unfortunately, 𝘗𝘢𝘅𝘓𝑚 passed away in early 2021 and was not able to see the exhibition come to fruition. We were lucky in that we were able to travel to Florida in late 2019 to record a video interview with him for inclusion in the show. And he was able to help me quite a bit with my research and understanding of the parachute concept and philosophy. He was a really remarkable and highly intelligent man, and I feel very lucky to have had the chance to meet and converse with him. So what was Nicola's parachute archive composed of? Nicola had saved about 800 garments and many, many boxes of photographs, business documents, sketches, press clippings, fashion magazines, and other ephemeral objects like garments, labels, promotional postcards, and button pins. I'd like to elaborate a bit on Nicola's garment collection and how we came up with the ensembles that you see in the exhibition. In the summer of 2019, Nicola and I engaged in object-based research and styling exercises to come up with the ensembles that you see on display. We had a mannequin, a camera, and we just started putting outfits together over the course of about 3 months. Nicola and I styled approximately 275 possible ensembles. What you see here on this slide are some of the outfits that didn't make it into the show, including some of the children's fashion that we had to play with. We made several important observations during these styling sessions that we applied in the exhibition. For example, parachute garments tended to look better layered. Because of the layering, we often put mannequins' hands in their pockets. It allowed us to show off the layers really well. Hands and pockets also communicated an ease or casualness that we really liked. It was a giant fashion puzzle. We tried the same shirt, for example, with multiple pairs of pants, skirts, jackets, etc., until we found the best configurations. It really was the work of a fashion stylist more than a fashion curator. And from these 275 options, we selected the best 65 for inclusion in the exhibition. All good exhibitions should answer a question or tell a story. So what was the story that emerged from the oral history, object-based, and archival research I engaged in? What is the thesis of this show? With this exhibition, we set out to explore how Nicola Pelly and 𝗪𝗓𝗧𝗪 developed Parachute's cool underground image, and how the duo transformed subcultural new wave street fashion into a sophisticated global designer brand at the dawn of the digital age. What are the main themes that we explored in the 5 zones of the exhibition that told this story? Zone 1, New Wave Beginnings, we present the foundation of Parachute's image. Zone 2, Collage and Hybrid, we present the conception of the image and the designer's process. Zone 3, Underground Images, we present the styling or marketing of the image and the brand's promotional photography. Zone 4, Music Videos, Rock Stars and Miami Vice. We really discuss the celebrity factor in the brand's success. And finally, Zone 5, the store experience, we present how Parachute sold this image. I'd like to briefly mention how the Parachute Archive guided the exhibition design in addition to my curatorial work. We collaborated with 𝘗𝘢𝘳𝘢𝘅𝑒𝑚, who were really interested in studying all of the material and photographs related to the Parachute store spaces. The material choices that you see throughout the exhibition, so the concrete, the neon lights, painted cardboard sonotubes, cast aluminum racks, platforms with clothing presented two-dimensionally, and colors like gray and this cobalt blue seen in the paint chips at right are directly linked to 𝘗𝘧𝘪𝑒𝑟𝑒𝑚 architecture and the design of the Parachute stores. It's important to realize, though, that we did not simply want to recreate the past. 𝘗𝘢𝘅𝑒𝑚 and his team were amazing in using the 80s high-tech aesthetic of Parachute as a starting point, but updating it and making it feel more contemporary for this retrospective exhibition. So let's virtually walk through the exhibition, and I'll bring some of the notable content and curatorial challenges we face to your attention. Right away, as we enter the exhibition, we present this trio of mannequins, which were selected to open the show as Nicola and I agreed they were just such iconic Parachute ensembles. We chose this trio as the collection that they were a part of, Autumn-Winter 1981, was just so well documented in the archive. I found artistic and technical sketches and promotional material like postcards and photographs showing these garments. They allowed us to date the ensembles very precisely, incorporate the original style names into our object labels, and guided our styling of the mannequins. They also date from the early 1980s, which is significant as it was a very successful and influential era in the history of the Parachute brand. For our first thematic zone of the exhibition, we start in Montreal with an exploration of Parachute's new wave beginnings, its connection to subculture, and its first store on Crescent Street. We have this photo at right of the Crescent Street store interior, where the centerpiece was this brown neon logo sign, the brand's first logo that was really inspired by an open parachute. From day one, we wanted to replicate this sign and make it a focal point of our exhibition as well, and also use this space around this neon sign as a great Instagrammable moment where visitors could take photos and help us promote the show through social media. Parachute's new wave era was short-lived, only from about 1977 to 1980 or so, and clothing from this era was definitely lacking in Nicola's archive. We were able to dress 5 mannequins from her collection and bumped it up to 7 with some borrowed jumpsuits, one of which was generously loaned by 𝘗𝘢𝘅𝑒𝑚, celebrated local VJ, DJ, and music critic, which made a nice connection to Montreal's vibrant music scene of the era. Due to the lack of existing garments, we really relied on photographs such as these, taken in the Parachute Design Studio and the Crescent Street store, which we reproduced, enlarged, and used as wall decals. These photos allowed us to show the wide range of the colorful and fun new wave fashions, even though we were limited in actual garments at our disposal. In terms of the archival material that we presented in this thematic zone, I wanted to make sure that the selection visually communicated the do-it-yourself bricolage design practice of new wave and of subculture in general. Parachute went on to develop a slick and sophisticated aesthetic, but the early new wave years were gritty with a really authentic underground feel. I chose promotional material like these flyers that were collaged together or photocopied and stamped, and these great punky / futuristic sketches drawn by Nicola Pelly in 1979, all of which embodied a do-it-yourself approach. A large section of this thematic zone presents Parachute's link to Montreal's nightlife scene at the end of the 1970s, as the brand often participated in nightclub fashion shows and parties during its fledgling years. Photographs from these shows were a really important content of this zone, and we reproduced and enlarged them and used them as a kind of wallpaper in one corner of the gallery space. We made a choice early on to treat almost all photos in this exhibition as reproductions. It just didn't seem right with Parachute's edgy brand image to treat photos as works of art. Parachute was street fashion, not haute couture, and it didn't feel correct to treat these images preciously. In this case, we kept the edges of the negatives and overlapped the photos, inspired a bit by fly posting or the illegal postering of abandoned urban buildings and construction walls. With these photos, we really see the vibrancy of new wave, not only the elaborate hair, makeup, and gender fluidity, but also the overall carnivalesque nature of Montreal's nightclub scene at the time. A second set of nightclub photos creatively solved a problem for us in this zone of the exhibition. Overall, video content, so concert footage, in-store fashion shows, or self-produced fashion films found in Nicola's archive, was a really important element of the show. We felt that the parachute clothing, divorced from an active human body, lost some of its potency due to static mannequins. So wherever we could, we used video content to bring some much needed dynamism to the exhibition. Unfortunately, we had no new wave era video footage to work with, but we had a series of 20 slides taken at a fashion show created by Dick Walsh at the Limelight nightclub in 1979. These slides were projected onto suspended panels of an organza-like fabric, which were overlapped and moved as visitors walked by. These projections were accompanied by 2 early Men Without Hats songs, Men Without Hats being one of the biggest success stories that emerged from Montreal's new wave music scene. The idea was to have visitors feel as if they had been transported to a nightclub at the start of the 1980s. With the image, music, lights, and movement, we wanted to create an immersive experience. In our second thematic zone of the exhibition, we explore Harry and Nicola's postmodern design process. The duo dubbed their approach to design collage and hybrid. They synthesized sartorial references from many cultures and eras to produce challenging and contemporary silhouettes. The parachute approach to dressing was intellectual, and the clothing was loaded with symbolism and multi-layered meaning. Harry and Nicola aimed to provide clients with a stylish vocabulary of garments with which they could create their own unique personal language. Dressing in Parachute was interpretive, and clients were really expected to meet Harry and Nicola halfway in the design process. Looks were never imposed on clients. Instead, it was up to you as a client to craft your own look. Knowing this, my challenge in this section was to find a balance between providing information or instruction. So what were the codes or sources of inspiration that Harry and Nicola drew from, but also to leave room for visitors to interpret what they see in the garments themselves. So the clothing presented in this zone was divided into in the photo at left. Again, design choices here were drawn directly from the photos in the parachute stores. In this case, the 2-dimensional presentation of clothing on inclined platforms and hung vertically from walls in the Soho store, and the cobalt blue sonotube columns in the Columbus Avenue store, both in New York. In my research, I had identified 6 hallmarks of the parachute style, and 5 of these were presented in groups of 2, so one flat, one suspended, with a short text explaining why the source of inspiration was important to the designers. So here in this photo from left to right, we discuss androgyny, active sportswear, Japan and Asia, military uniforms, and anti-heroes such as bikers, cowboys, gangsters, and jazz musicians. Each duo was clearly separated by the clever use of the sonotubes. On a side note, this two-dimensional mounting of ensembles, flat and suspended vertically, was very innovative work for us here at the museum and represents a team effort involving the curatorial, conservation, and exhibition departments. Nicola and I spoke at length about this mounting process in a recent talk entitled Parachute, a Brand, and Exhibition. I invite you to visit the museum's YouTube channel to watch and learn more if this interests you. The ensembles on mannequins and the rest of this thematic zone were designated for individual interpretation on the part of the visitors. It was my intention that visitors would read the texts linked to the two ensembles presented two-dimensionally, and then spend time with the mannequins deciding what references they saw themselves in the fashion. I took the parachute notion of user participation to heart and hope our visitors had fun looking at and deciphering the parachute codes for themselves. The sixth hallmark of the parachute style, architectural silhouettes, was more difficult to present. As Harry was an architect, it's an influence that is everywhere in all of the garments, so we couldn't treat this theme as the other hallmarks were treated with very precise examples. Initially, I found this photo of an architectural model at bottom left, designed by Harry and Melvin Charney. It was a proposal for the design of the Canadian pavilion at the Osaka World Fair in 1970, and really foreshadowed the industrial high-tech aesthetic of the later parachute stores. There had been talk to rebuild this model, but the idea was scrapped as all we had was this one view of the photograph, so too little information to recreate it. Its fabrication would have eaten up valuable budget, and maybe using a model to talk about architectural elements in parachute clothing was getting a bit too far from what we wanted to present in a fashion exhibition. In my archival research, however, I had noted a large amount of promotional photos and ads that featured models wearing parachute posed in architectural settings. In fact, this photo at center by John Kalau really reminded me of Harry's model for the Canadian pavilion design. In the end, we presented 3 of these parachute ads in a vitrine, accompanied by this beautiful and dramatic reproduction photo at right, taken by Bobby Sheehan of models on a New York rooftop to visually communicate the importance of architecture to the brand. In this thematic zone, as we were presenting Harry and Nicola's creative process, exhibition designer 𝘗𝘢𝘕 wanted to recreate the look and feel of a fashion design studio. I had found some photos during my archival research of 𝘗𝘗𝘅𝑒's studio, where Harry and Nicola designed small collections for the company during the mid-70s. So we decided to reference these photos, installing a cork board with lots of images and fabric swatches pinned to it, with additional material haphazardly placed on cutting tables below. As the curator of this exhibition, I was a bit concerned about this, as with archival material, we must respect conservation rules, and no original documents or photos could be pinned to a wall. The material would have to be reproductions. I was afraid of sending confusing messages to our visitors as to what was an original archival photo or document and what was a reproduction, used more as an element of the exhibition design. I felt that the original material presented under plexiglass on the cutting tables had to be completely different from what was pinned on the walls above this to avoid confusion. To solve this problem, we decided to use 3 types of objects to pin on the cork board that would really read as working documents from a design studio. The first was this wonderful series of 21 sketches of garments, which had been done by an intern in the early 80s at the Soho store in New York. To me, these sketches really looked like work-in-progress drawings and were stylistically different from Nicola's original sketches we wanted to present on the cutting tables. So we reproduced and enlarged this complete series to pin to the wall. We also had access to a very large group of 4x6 prints that Nicola and I named styling photos. These photos, of which there are hundreds in the archive, represent an important part of Harry and Nicola's design process. So store and studio employees in New York and Montreal would model garments in progress. In these photos, you see the same shirt, for example, styled differently, worn with pants or skirts or under long coats. You also see the same garments worn on men and women, bearing witness to the unisex nature of parachute. With these styling photos, we found that grouping them together en masse gave a really strong visual impact. At left are some of the photocopies of the images I taped together when we were testing this idea out. In the end, we chose approximately the 50 best of these photos, reproduced and enlarged them, and pinned them to the wall with the sketches. Nicola had also saved many fabric samples and swatches, in some cases, fabrics that you see used in actual garments in the exhibition. Although they were not acquired by the museum, we used these original swatches to pin in between the photos with buttons and other sewing notions, which really brought the whole idea of the studio wall to life. For the original objects that we placed on the cutting tables, Nicola and I selected a wide range of business documents, artistic and technical sketches, ads, flyers, and other ephemeral objects that showed the same inspirations or hallmarks that we had identified in the clothes. So as you can see here in these three examples, Japan and Asia, a military fighter jet, and an ad that shows clothes a bit inspired by leather garments worn by bikers, and 1930s and 1940s gangster fedoras. We also included a selection of international fashion editorial clippings from GQ, American Vogue, and Italian and Japanese fashion magazines to visually communicate the vast reach of parachute during the 1980s. As I had mentioned before, in the spirit of replicating the look of a working design studio, we thought initially we would present the original material in a haphazard way on the cutting tables, layered on top of each other. Given the sheer amount of material presented on these tables, we engaged in pre-mounting exercises with the museum's exhibition technicians to work out the arrangement and make sure everything would fit. And we quickly realized that this arrangement had to be more ordered and clean. It just didn't look good haphazardly placed. Thanks to these pre-mounting exercises, we worked out all of the kinks ahead of time. So when it came time to install these objects in the gallery, we had photos to guide us, and the process was quite efficient. In the end, this wall and table were successful without sending confusing messages or overwhelming the visitor visually. It also provided us an opportunity to really show the range and richness of the material in Nicola's archive. Traditional garments of Asia, in particular Japan, were major sources of inspiration for parachute. During the 1980s, Nicola and Harry frequently traveled to Hong Kong and Japan for production and to source fabrics. And their exposure to traditional garments on these trips, like kimono and samurai armor in museums, made a deep impression on the duo. In conversation, Harry also talked about his love of Japanese modernist architecture, in particular the work of Kunio Maekawa and the Metabolists. While developing the content for this exhibition, the question of, is this cultural appropriation, came up a few times in conversation between Nicola and I, with museum staff, and with some of our external collaborators. Even during the 1980s, parachute's heavy use of Japanese sartorial traditions was questioned by some of the more critical journalists of the time. An article about the Soho, New York store, which ran in British countercultural magazine The Face in 1983, asked, given that the designers were of American and British heritage, if parachute was too Japanese. And in the context of the West's cultural fixation on Japan during the 1980s, also cheekily asked if parachute was Japanese enough. The case of parachute in Japan is very interesting. Was it cultural appropriation, cultural appreciation, or was something else going on? I tried to tackle these questions with three objects we presented together on the cutting tables, set apart from the rest of the material and accompanied by a short text. Japanese customers were amongst the first to discover parachute in New York. And as Nicola recalled, they just intrinsically understood the brand and wholeheartedly embraced it. Here's an ad for parachute in a menswear magazine, Brutus, from about 1983. The popularity of parachute amongst Japanese tourists in New York led not only to Japan Airlines filming a commercial in the Soho store on Worcester Street, but also to a licensing agreement with the Ada Trading Company of Tokyo. And the brand was sold at more than 30 boutiques and department stores throughout the country, as is shown on this map at top right. Outside of the United States, Japan became one of the most lucrative markets for parachute. The t-shirt version of the logoed sweatshirt at left obviously inspired by the Japanese national flag, sold 26,000 models in Japan the first 2 weeks that it was available in stores. By presenting these three objects together, I wanted to show the symbiotic nature of the relationship between Parachute and Japan. I hope this little group made visitors think about appropriation in fashion and decide for themselves, given the reciprocity between Parachute and Japan, if Harry and Nicola were appropriating in their design process or not. After the heavy content of the collage and hybrid section of this exhibition, we wanted to strip things back to present our third thematic zone, underground images, and exploration of the brand's promotional photography in a more minimal and airy space. With the design of the photography section, we again used large format reproduction photos, this time on light boxes that were actually reused from the McCord's exhibition on the William Notman Photo Studio from 2016. In terms of the design or layout of this zone, we had one large light box which put a lot of focus on one photo in particular. Additionally, due to vistas of the exhibition, you could see this photo from both the first New Wave zone and the second collage and hybrid zone, so it had to be really special. My oral history research involved tracking down people who were involved with Parachute, and this included models. I had the pleasure of meeting many models who worked for the brand, including this man in the Serge Barbeau photo, Shannon Greer. After chatting with him and learning about his background and modeling career, so he grew up in Soho, he was an aspiring painter and was scouted in a Manhattan nightclub as a teenager to be a model. He had a successful modeling career before switching gears and becoming a photographer himself. For me, he just represented the brand ideal, a streetwise, artistic kid who emanated a cool androgyny. I was convinced that not only should this photo be the star image of this thematic zone, it should also be the promotional image for the exhibition poster. I was very pleased that Parachute gave us an opportunity to use a male model to promote our show, something a bit atypical in that it has traditionally been photos of female models associated with fashion exhibitions. As I mentioned in regard to the styling photos on our atelier wall in the collage and hybrid zone of the exhibition, the idea of presenting large groups of objects or images together worked really well with Parachute, and we replicated this idea again in our photography zone. The reproduction photos presented together on light boxes at the image at left represent a decade of Parachute image making from approximately 1981 to 1991. And the large group of them together brought a lot of dynamism to the space. To me, what is so striking about Parachute's photography is just how contemporary its aesthetic is, and is a visual reminder of just how outside of the mainstream the brand was, especially in terms of the beauty ideal of the 1980s. Our wall of 46 promotional postcards, seen at right, was treated in a similar fashion to the photos. A secondary message I wanted to communicate with this exhibition was that Parachute existed in the pre-internet era. And for me, the postcards are such a wonderful and graphic example of how a brand like Parachute, with its marginal reputation, managed to promote themselves covertly in an era before things like social media. I also found them intriguing as they were obviously inspired by the nightclub flyering practices of the 80s and 90s. So again, objects that connect Parachute back to street and nightlife culture of the era. The fourth thematic zone of the exhibition presents Parachute's celebrity connection and how the brand benefited greatly in the MTV and music video era. At the start of this zone, we present 3 jackets linked to Madonna, Michael Jackson, and Duran Duran, who were all Parachute clients. We wanted to use these figures, however, as a way to discuss important musical events of the decade. For example, Madonna and the Live Aid concert from 1986. Michael Jackson was undoubtedly the pop star of the 1980s, but also a very problematic figure. We were hesitant initially to even include him in the exhibition, but we decided to use him as a conduit to discuss the systemic racism of the era. I realized early on that this exhibition was very white and lacking in diversity. Rather than just say, oh, well, that's the history, I decided to dig deeper to ask why. My research brought me to several places or explanations, one being MTV, Michael Jackson, and his Thriller album from 1982. MTV originally positioned itself as a rock network, catering to a primarily suburban white audience, and refused to play Black pop music. Other pop and rock stars of the time called them out, David Bowie and Rick James, for example. But nothing really changed until Michael Jackson came along with Thriller, and in particular, his video for Billie Jean. After a lot of pressure from his label, MTV played the video, and it became a smash hit. Jackson and Thriller not only opened the door for other Black artists, he changed the music video format from a promotional tool to a dynamic and creative art form. My hope by presenting Jackson and this story is that we shone a bit of light on the institutional racism of influential culture producers of the 1980s like MTV, and offered one explanation as to why an exhibition about 80s fashion and pop culture lacks diversity. In addition to dressing rock stars, Parachute was a major wardrobe provider for NBC's long-running television show Miami Vice, which was dubbed MTV Cops at the time. We wanted to present a small section of this fourth zone related to the show, and I spent several weeks watching many episodes of Miami Vice to see if I could identify any garments or ensembles in Nicola's collection, and unfortunately this wasn't very successful. Philip Michael Thomas rarely wore Parachute. In fact, Hugo Boss was another major wardrobe supplier, and I thought maybe he dressed more in Boss than in Parachute. Don Johnson did wear some Parachute, but nothing head to toe. It was mixed in with other brands like Giorgio Armani and Gianni Versace. It was really the drug dealers who dressed in a lot of Parachute. What we ended up doing was dressing the mannequin at right in a navy blue unstructured suit that was actually donated by 𝗵𝗓𝘄𝗧 himself, with a Henley t-shirt underneath. So an ensemble that looked a lot like what Don Johnson wore on the show. On Miami Vice, Don Johnson constantly had his hands in his pockets, so we replicated this with the body positioning of the two mannequins. I also wanted to use Miami Vice to talk about greater trends in menswear. Don Johnson and his casual look on the show was hugely influential during the 1980s on men's fashion. Italian designers like Armani are often credited with pioneering the more relaxed, unstructured look of men's fashion at the time, thanks in part to Miami Vice. But Parachute should also be considered a brand who helped popularize these rakish and cool new menswear silhouettes, as their clothing appeared so regularly on the show. It's no surprise then that Italy was another huge market for Parachute. With this Miami Vice section, we presented a special Parachute catalog printed in Italian menswear magazine Mondo Uomo in 1983. The pants worn by the second mannequin are identical to what you see in the catalog, with the shirt being incredibly similar to the photo at right. In a thematic zone about music videos, it was essential to recreate the look and feel of MTV and other video networks like Much Music and Music Plus. And the majority of this space was taken up by a wonderful installation of screens overlapping in a corner and piled up on the floor. Initially, we had wanted to play music videos from the 80s where rock and pop stars were wearing parachute, but it was really hard to find good examples. There was also the issue of budget. Clearing rights for music videos would have been far too expensive, so we needed another solution. Luckily, we had Nicola's collection of fashion show videos and self-produced creative fashion films inspired by the music video format to play with. We combined these with footage of Madonna's performance at Live Aid and some Peter Gabriel concert footage from 1986 and 1993, where they both wore Parachute. All of these videos were edited together using short segments and quick cuts interspersed with Parachute logos. This was inspired by MTV and how their iconic logos would often be inserted between videos. Our 11-minute-long video montage was set to a Peter Gabriel and Madonna soundtrack and was really our affordable homage to MTV. It also allowed us to show a lot of Parachute video footage, so 7 videos in total, in one space of the exhibition. An exhibition is educational, but visitors should also have an emotional experience. And I think this bombardment of video footage, music, and logos was a successful immersive or experiential zone of the exhibition. For our final thematic zone, the store experience, the design of the space was directly informed by store photos found in the archive. At left, we have a photo of the Parachute stores in Bal Harbour, Florida, and on Columbus Avenue in New York. 𝘮𝘰𝘥𝘦 and his team used these photos as inspiration for the tall bank of televisions, the platforms with clothing displayed flat, and the bright blue sonotube columns. In the original stores, the banks of televisions were used to play fashion show footage or the self-produced videos we showed in our MTV thematic zone. For our exhibition, we used the televisions to show photos of all of the original parachute stores, with one screen playing our video interview with Harry talking about Parachute's connection to architecture and the concepts behind his store spaces. In this thematic zone, we presented 5 cities where Parachute had stores: New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Belle Harbor, and Montreal. Our graphic designer for the exhibition, Brian K. Lamond and studio principal, was inspired by the fabric banners Parachute used in their stores. The photo at top right shows 3 banners hanging behind the cash register at the Belle Harbor store, and banners often appeared behind models in the styling photos seen at bottom right. Brian Lamond cleverly used the banners as a design element of the space. Their verticality coupled with the height of the sonotubes really used the height of the space to great advantage, and the city names are a very bold graphic element. At the bottom of each banner at eye level, he printed the texts and stories associated with each city and store. So the banners are not only informative, they provide some graphic drama, much like the original banners did in stores and in styling photos. On the topic of Brian K. Lamond and studio principal, they did a phenomenal job with the graphic design throughout the exhibition. The wall texts and treatments for each thematic zone were an integral part of the show, again connected to street culture as they were inspired by fly posting. I really appreciated Brian's art historical knowledge. In an early meeting, he said he wanted to use the text-based art of American Lawrence Weiner as inspiration for these wall texts and treatments. Weiner was repped by Leo Castelli in New York, whose roster of artists read like a who's who of avant-garde American art from the mid-60s forward. In the 1970s and the 1980s, Castelli had 2 galleries in Soho. So Weiner's work was a part of the radical artistic environment that Parachute aligned itself with in New York City. So in my opinion, an excellent design reference for this exhibition. Additionally, in a show where we present such a large volume of material, lots of photographs, archival documents, and layered looks on mannequins, we had a lot of labels, and even more so when you factor in our need for both French and English labeling. Our exhibition really ran the risk of being overrun with labels, which would have ruined the minimal, clean aesthetic of Parachute. With Brian and studio principal, we decided to make a visitor's guide. In conversation with Nicola and I, Brian proposed a booklet that looked a little bit like a sketchbook. So again, rough and gritty, printed on a newsprint-like paper, and definitely not a precious document. I combed the archive looking for sketches, doodles, and architectural drawings, anything that looked or felt like it was something you would find in a designer's sketchbook, to add a bit of visual interest to the visitor's guide. I think it's a really successful document, not only informative, but with all the visual content that we added, a nice free souvenir for visitors to take home with them. In this final section of the exhibition, we decided to present another group of clothing 2-dimensionally, again referencing how garments were displayed in stores as we see in this photo from Soho, New York at the top right. At left, this is a great shot of the platforms in the store experience, taken by exhibition technician Patrick Mignot from the Cherry Picker shortly before opening last November. Early 20th century avant-garde art was a recurring source of visual inspiration for Parachute. You find references to modernism, to Dada, surrealism, and de stijl in Parachute garments, images, and graphic design. Russian constructivism was another major source of inspiration. In fact, the 1986-1987 autumn-winter collection, named Political Warriors and Heroes of the Night, took cues from Russian Red Army uniforms, but also the work of constructivist artists like Alexander Rodchenko and 𝘮𝘲𝘅𝑒𝑙. Once we started working on pre-mounting exercises with our technicians and conservators of the flat ensembles, I began thinking how similar they looked to the experimental sportswear of constructivist artist 𝗪𝗓𝗪 Stepanova, both the graphic nature of the clothes and their linear simplicity. Very late in the development process of this exhibition, Nicola shared with me several pages of unpublished memoirs Harry was working at before his death. And sure enough, I found a passage where he mentioned his admiration for the work of Stepanova. So it really validated the choices that we made in regards to how this clothing was displayed. We installed a full set of stadium bleachers into the space, just like the ones that were used in the Soho store in New York. These bleachers served as seating during in-store fashion shows and performances. They were used for display, as a place to sit and people watch, something Andy Warhol often did while eating his lunch, and also as a backdrop for countless photo shoots. This great photo taken at top right by Bobby Sheehan in the Soho, New York store in 1980 was the inspiration for the presentation of 12 mannequins together on the bleachers. As most of Parachut's fashion is quite somber and monochromatic, this pop of color at the end of the show provided a wow factor and a really dramatic finale. As with the archival material and photographs, even parachute ensembles tended to look their best grouped together. It just made a really strong visual impact. Throughout the exhibition, we presented a selection of Parachut's children's fashion, which Nicola began designing after the birth of her and Harry's daughter in 1984. A lot of these ensembles are mini versions of the adult fashion on display, but in some cases, the children's garments were the only example we had of certain Parachute collections. For example, this little brocaded jacket presented flat in this final thematic zone from spring-summer 1985 corresponds to the clothing worn in this promotional photograph at left, taken by Albert Sanchez in the Beverly Hills store in Los Angeles. We chose to use this photo again as a very large reproduction on a wall as visitors leave the exhibition, as for me, it just summed up Parachute so well. Authentically cool and creative young people hanging out in Parachute's minimalist yet grand store spaces, dressed in their own take of the brand's hip street fashion. It's just such a joyous, fun photo that captures the spirit of the brand and was a great way to end our journey through the Parachute world on a high note. So that concludes my presentation for today. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'd be happy to take any questions you may have now.
Oui, donc Alexis, we already have one question from Mauricio. Are there any similarities or parallelisms between Parachute's design ethos and the sentiment of today's global fashion landscape? I can read it again if you want.
Yeah, sure. Maybe one more time.
Yeah. Are there any similarities or parallelisms between Parachute's design ethos and the sentiment of today's global fashion landscape?
Well, I guess in the 80s is when we're really entering into maybe a more global fashion system. I mean, I know in conversation with Harry and Nicola, both of them talked about the importance of travel to their design process. And a lot of the travel was linked to work as well. Like they were traveling the world to source fabrics, like I said before, in Hong Kong and Japan, but also in Europe. I think even while they were working for 𝘗𝘢𝘅𝑒𝑎teau, they were traveling around the world doing trend research. So I think just through those travels, they were exposed to quite a bit of international design and international retail. And I'm sure it must have had an impact on their design process. I also think in conversation with both of them, when I asked the question, should Parachute even be considered a Canadian brand in the first place, considering most of the success occurred because of a presence south of the border, in particular in New York? And both of them really hesitated to say yes or no. For both of them, I think it was Canadian, but it wasn't Canadian. And I think with Harry, with conversations with Harry, he just straight up said that for him, Parachute was international.
Okay, well, thank you, Alexis. I don't know. Don't be shy if you have any questions, people. We'll be glad. Alexis will be glad to answer. It can be in French as well.
No.
Okay. And Alexis, I don't know if there was anything you wanted to add. You know, sometimes when you plan a conference, you had a short amount of time. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add a little bit or...
No, I mean, I think between today and, like I said, the presentation Nicola and I gave a few weeks ago called Parachute, a Brand and Exhibition, I think between those two, we have the content and the planification of the show covered. So as I said before, if you want to know more in particular about mounting and mannequins, check out the museum's YouTube channel.
Oh, donc, oui, j'ai une question en français. Selon toi, Alexis, quel sera l'héritage de l'exposition sur la marque?
Quel sera quoi?
Quel sera l'héritage de l'exposition sur la marque?
Mais je pense que pour moi, ce qui est important avec Parachute et peut-être ce qui a duré de ce qu'ils ont fait, c'est que pendant les années 80, je pense que tu as beaucoup de compagnies comme Parachute, mais aussi les autres comme Dapper Dan, comme Nike et Air Jordans, comme Stussy, beaucoup de marques qui ont travaillé avec du street fashion et un style de mode qui peut-être a devenu ce qu'on s'appelle le streetwear aujourd'hui. Et je pense que tout le monde qui aime la mode connaît très bien que maintenant le streetwear est le style ou le niche comme plus dominante dans toute la mode. Et maintenant, ça est devenu quelque chose vraiment mainstream. Mais je pense qu'à cette époque, c'était encore très marginal. Alors c'est ça. Pour moi, je pense que Parachute est un morceau d'une casse-tête de beaucoup de morceaux qui sont un petit peu en avant de streetwear, mais qui a peut-être fait cette fondation d'un style de mode si important aujourd'hui.
Merci, Alexis. On a une autre question de Josiane Mascotte. Elle voudrait savoir combien de temps ça vous a pris pour la recherche et monter l'exposition.
Mais alors, on a commencé en 2019. Et initialement, on a pensé d'ouvrir l'expo en novembre 2020, mais à cause du COVID, tout était reporté. Alors, j'ai pris ce temps extra pendant que le musée était fermé, que tout le monde était chez eux pour continuer la recherche. Et c'était dans cette période-là que j'ai commencé à faire cette recherche de les histoires orales, de contacter tous les gens qui ont travaillé pour la boutique, qui ont été mannequins, photographes. Alors, ça me donnait beaucoup plus de temps de faire la recherche et je pense que grâce à COVID, mon connaissance de la marque était vraiment enrichissée et c'était dans cette période-là que j'ai commencé à écrire le livre aussi. Alors oui, c'est ça, entre 2019 et 2021, alors 2 ans, 3 ans. Mais honnêtement, même ce matin, j'ai reçu un courriel d'un autre gars qui a travaillé à Los Angeles, une autre femme qui a travaillé à New York. Alors ça continue. Je pense qu'avec Parachute, c'est une recherche que peut-être de temps partiel, je vais continuer quand les gens m'approchent avec leurs histoires.
C'est bon, mais comme dans tout, on voit qu'il y a eu des bons et des moins bons côtés avec la COVID.
Oui.
J'ai une autre question, c'est Sébastien Lavoie. Will this exhibition travel to other museums around the world?
I hope so. I think right now there's no plans, but fingers crossed that it can, because I think for me, Parachute is as much a New York thing as it is a Montreal thing. So for me personally, I would love to see it at a New York institution.
Oui, vraiment. Et puis also that Parachute was really, known around the world. So I think it would be really interesting. Yeah. And also, could you talk a bit more about, en fait, la question est en français, parler un peu plus de la réalisation de l'ouvrage qui accompagne l'exposition Parachute.
Est-ce que tu peux répéter ça, Lisa?
Pourrais-tu nous parler un petit peu de la réalisation de l'ouvrage du livre que tu as écrit qui accompagne l'exposition Parachute?
Oui, mais bien sûr. Alors, comme j'ai dit, c'était avec COVID où j'ai eu plus le temps de rechercher cette marque et j'ai réalisé que l'histoire Parachute est beaucoup plus grande que ce qu'on peut présenter dans une expo. Alors ça, c'est pourquoi j'ai commencé à écrire le livre et surtout avec les entrevues que j'ai faites, j'ai réalisé que l'histoire new-yorkaise était très grande, mais aussi le côté ouest des États-Unis, l'histoire de Los Angeles était aussi si intéressante. le frère de notre designer, 𝘗𝘢𝘳𝘢𝘷𝘦, son frère 𝘗𝘢𝘳𝘢𝘳𝑚 à Los Angeles a une compagnie qui s'appelle Perron-Roedinger. Et là-bas, ils font le design et mise en scène pour les rock stars, il fait les albums de disques, il veut commencer à faire les livres. Alors, quand j'ai présenté le contenu à eux, pour voir s'ils en étaient intéressés en fait le design d'un livre, ils ont capoté. Mais j'ai trouvé ça comme partout avec cette expo. Chaque fois que quelqu'un a consulté l'archive de Nicola, surtout les gens visuels, les gens artistiques, tout le monde a réalisé tout à coup que c'est vraiment comme une gold mine de matériaux, parce que tu as un contenu très riche, mais au même temps, tu as une esthétique très riche. Alors, c'est ça, avec Perron-Roedinger, en particulier le graphiste là-bas, Brian Roedinger. On a créé le livre l'année passée. C'était publié en novembre l'année passée, mais malheureusement pour le moment, avec COVID, on a beaucoup de délais de livraison. Alors, je promets qu'une trentaine de livres va arriver au musée bientôt, j'espère. Mais si les gens sont intéressés, je suggère juste à contacter la boutique pour les nouvelles.
Oui, mais oui, ça va être très intéressant à lire, j'en suis certaine. Une autre question de Valérie Picard. Would you have preferred to have access to a larger space for the exhibit?
I mean, I guess I never really thought of that. I think we were very happy here at the McCord to have access to our high wall gallery. So that's the gallery with like the double height ceiling, because it was just like serendipity that we had that space and that we wanted to recreate parachute stores, which were enormous. So that worked really well for me. I didn't really think about having a bigger space. I mean, is bigger better? I don't know. I mean, I guess for me, one of the things that I like in my job is the process of working on an exhibition, and that in a museum, there are so many constraints, right? Like we're constrained by budget, we're constrained by conservation rules and the protection of garments. So I tend to see these things as challenges, and I'm always really into the process of working collaboratively here at the museum to creatively problem solve and basically work with what we have. And I think we always really do a good job of making the most of the objects we have, the spaces that we have, and putting on really good shows.
Merci. On a plus de questions, là. Ça rentre un petit peu. Donc, de 𝘗𝘗𝘅, on a entendu souvent la phrase « la mode a un cycle de 20 ans ». Il dit qu'il a l'impression que c'est plutôt 30 ans avant de revoir concrètement les influences revenir dans notre époque. Que pensez-vous du constant retour dans le passé pour inspirer la mode actuelle?
Mais je pense que c'est juste partie de la mode, non? Qu'on a ces cycles comme ça. Et oui, j'ai entendu la même chose. Pour moi, je pense que c'est plus 30 ans. Mais je pense qu'on est vraiment chanceux ici au McCord que cette époque, les années 80-90, sont si à la mode maintenant, parce que ça fait une bonne lien. Je pense que beaucoup de gens, surtout les jeunes gens qui arrivent ici, je veux qu'ils réalisent que tout qu'ils portent aujourd'hui, ça vient de la passé, ça vient de cette époque-là, les années 80.
Et oui, absolument. Et puis, ça va être la dernière question. So it will be the last question. Please tell us how you chose from the archive what to acquire for the collection. How did you approach that?
Usually when I start with working with big archives like this, I always freak out a bit in the beginning because I don't know what to do. And in this case, I think it was really difficult because there was just so much good stuff. You know, I think it depends. I think for us, it's always good when we can cross-reference things. So if we have a garment where there's also, say, a photo, a sketch, fabric samples, whatever, I mean, that makes for a really good grouping, and definitely any kind of archival material that can help with dating. And in this case, as I mentioned before, it was so precise in terms of we had actual style names and style numbers and collection names. So yeah, that's it. I think in this case, we took almost everything that Nicola offered us in terms of documents and photos. You know, things like doubles or triples, we tend not to acquire. But in this case, like I said, it was very difficult just because of how much good stuff was there. But I think in terms of garments, what you see in the show, most of what's there is stuff that we deem to be the best examples because of reasons I just mentioned. I think there's always sometimes a bit of an aesthetic evaluation if something is just so representative of its era. So yeah, the most of what you see in the exhibition is the clothing that we acquired.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Alexis.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you haven't seen Parachute, the exhibition yet, well, you can see it until April 24th. And if you want to see it in the comfort of your house, there are also virtual guided tours. There will be one on March 26th at 1 p.m. in English. Et donc, comme on disait, l'exposition Parachute est à l'affiche jusqu'au 24 avril. Si vous venez la voir au musée. Et il y aura aussi, si vous voulez rester dans le confort de votre maison, une visite virtuelle le samedi 26 mars à 11h en français. Donc, merci vraiment beaucoup tout le monde pour votre participation. Merci Alexis.
Merci. Bonne journée. Bye bye.
Bonne journée. Au revoir.